Thanks for joining us for this episode. And before we get started, I do want to let you know about the upcoming Church Advance Conference beginning February 8th. Now, it's hard to believe it's already 2023, and this conference is coming up very soon. So if you haven't registered yet, you're going to want to make sure that you do that as soon as possible because space is limited. You can register at bryansams.com, and you can get a discount if you use the code podcast when you go to register and purchase your tickets for this event. This is an awesome opportunity to enjoy powerful preaching from H.B. Charles, Kurt Skelly, Carrie Schmidt, and of course, Bryan Sams. There are also some really practical workshops. And being in beautiful Jacksonville, Florida in February is pretty awesome because the weather is fantastic. You are not going to want to miss this year's Church Advance Conference 2023, and we look forward to seeing you there. Again, remember to register at bryansams.com. Use that promo code podcast to get a discount. That's bryansams.com, promo code podcast. Now, we are going to get started with the main content of today's episode, where we are, of course, looking to continue to advance a reformation, a fellowship, partnership, and gospel hope amongst Bible-believing churches and pastors. This is Church Advance with Bryan Sams.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Church Advance podcast with Bryan Sams. This is your host, Bryan Sams, and today we have our co-host Luke Clayton in the house. Welcome, Luke.
Hey, yeah, good to be back.
Yeah.
Man, this has been good. This has been a good year of episodes so far.
Absolutely, and now we're really going to start getting into some kind of theological training content that's really going to guide us predominantly through the rest of the year. So I'm excited about that, and I thought, why not start off our talks this year by revisiting an old friend.
Yes, the classic.
The classic, the King James version of the Bible issue. Now, back a couple years ago, I focused on the theological aspects of this and the readability and what translation means as opposed to inspiration, preservation, all those things. I think we have well articulated our position there. Agree or disagree, that's where we are.
Sure.
But I also value the practical aspect of this subject, and maybe nothing is more practical than how really does a person move forward to use or to preach from a different translation of the Bible and their actual ministry context, because that's a question I get a lot about. Yeah. And it's not for everybody, but if it's going to happen, there's a way about in which you should do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, in our setting, we did it. I mean, we, in 2021, in January, was the first Sunday that I used a modern translation of the Bible. And so, now it's been a couple years. It's a thing that's long past us, not an issue anymore, but it's not always the case. So what I thought I would do was, I thought that with the questions I've got and with the experience that I've been through here, I thought I would kind of walk through how I went about doing that. Now, let me give you just a little context for those of you that maybe are new listeners. Obviously, you can go back to the old King James discussions that we had back in with Mark Ward and a couple with Aaron Chan and Wallace Miller and then Joshua Barzone, which was more recent, where we really walked through the issue. Yeah. This those podcast episodes I was doing before I changed translations at my church. Yeah. My history is independent, fundamental, Baptist, King James-only, no pants on women, kind of got context. Yeah. And obviously, I no longer believe that. And I've had guys ask me online, did you not believe this when you were, at such and such ministry? And the answer is yes. I am okay to say I have changed on this subject. Yeah. I mean, and I think I sincerely held it, sincerely believed it, and was sincerely misinformed. Yeah. And I believe that through God's grace and through the Word, through Spirit, through influence of teachers and preachers, God led me to a different conclusion.
Yeah.
So that ultimately led me as a local church pastor to, in time, make an official translation of the Bible. And it didn't happen overnight.
Yeah.
Most people don't realize it actually was a 5-year process.
Wow.
It did not happen until 2021. I became the pastor in 2026.
Yeah.
So I thought...
2016.
Yeah, 20...
Yeah.
What
You
did I
didn't
say,
go back.
2026?
2026.
2026. Sometimes I feel like it's 2026. This content specifically that I'm bringing today is a recap of a talk I did with Idea Network. They have a kind of an exclusive membership group that has exclusive content, and they've invited me from time to time. And so I put together a talk on the translation transition. How to go through the translation transition. So let's talk about that, Luke.
Hey, before we dive into the steps here, you've got several good steps. I know this was discussed in those previous episodes, but I do think for new listeners or just to kind of refresh our memories, I want you, because I think it's really powerful, I want you to just give us maybe the quick synopsis of why you would make this transition.
Yes.
Because I have heard it from other pastors that are maybe, in maybe their 40s or older, and they say, you know what, I'm just going to let the next guy worry about that.
Right.
Why did you say, you know what, no, I'm going to go ahead and do this now? I think it's good to revisit that before we dive
Absolutely.
in.
And I would say, I think that's the worst thing you could ever do, is leave something that you know needs to be done undone.
Yeah, wow.
To destroy what you build in the future. The fact is, if you know this change is going to take place, why not go ahead and tackle it?
Yeah.
So that others can live with it more effectively. In other words, I've said it here many times. I took this issue on the chin so that my kids didn't have to.
Yeah.
I also heard a leadership training recently. I should be more willing to be uncomfortable than to allow somebody under me to be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
In other words, I need to be willing to do what needs to be done as a lead. It's called leadership. I need to be willing to do what needs to be done in order for the church to succeed, for the next generation to be reached, etc. So I would say that is a big deal. So number one, I would just say that's just bad thinking altogether.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what subject you're talking about. If you're saying, I don't want to deal with that problem, I'm going to let the next guy deal with that problem, you're not leading.
Yeah.
Something's leading you, and it sounds like fear.
Yeah.
And I don't want to be afraid. I don't want to be fearful. So there's that. Then I would say the whys for me specifically were twofold. One, I became convinced about it. We'll talk about that when we get into the steps.
Sure.
But I became biblically convinced, scripturally convinced. Number two, my children.
Yeah.
That was, honestly, more important than anything to me was my own children. I did not want them growing up in a family where either A, I told them something I didn't believe, or B, forced them to be hypocrites because they could read a new translation of the Bible, they couldn't let anybody else know about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, what am I going to do if I'm in a King James-only church, but my kids read the ESV? What am I going to tell them?
Yeah.
You can't tell people at church. You got to memorize scripture. You're going to have to go over here and use this, and then, but at home, you can do this.
Yeah.
And I just think that duplistic thing creates. It might be easier for us to do, but it's not easy for the kids to swallow.
Yeah. Yeah.
On top of that, as it relates to my children, I've told the story many times before, but I think it's worth repeating. My son was in a Becca homeschool curriculum. This is back during COVID, and I was getting my doctorate at the time. This was the spring of 2020. Schools had shut down. I decided to use the time down from church to finish my doctorate.
Yeah.
And my son was doing homework. He was one of his homework assignments for a Bible class was to read the story of David and Goliath. And I was kind of excited. I was like, man, this is going to be great, man. And he had to read it. I think he even had to record it. Maybe I'm wrong. But nonetheless, I sat down with him, help him with his homework, and he's going to read 1 Samuel chapter 17. And pretty much every other word, I'm telling him how to pronounce it, telling him what it means.
Yeah.
I'm thinking to myself, wait, I know the whole story almost by memory. I mean, you know what word he's struggling with.
Sure.
You've been through this enough. And I finally he asked me this question. Well, Dad, if it means that, why doesn't it just say that?
Out of the mouth of babes.
I said, man, that's a great question, dude. Yeah. It's a great question. And from that point forward, my kids never used the King James again in their devotional. Both my older kids are doing their own devotions. They're reading the ESV. Yeah. This was long before we did this at church or even on air. Yeah. And I just said, my kids are not going to go through this. Yeah. By the time they're 20, this is over. Yeah. This is over. I know my daughter, who's 15 right now, we're not playing a game anymore. She ain't going to be reading the King James when she's 20. She's not. I mean, I don't have the conviction. She has the conviction. So I did it for my kids. And then the third thing is, I did it for the future of my church. Yeah. I did it for the opposite reason that hypothetical illustration you gave. I actually intentionally did it for that reason. Yeah. Feeling like the next pastor cannot be bound by this. He's likely going to be younger than me. I mean, I'm in my mid-40s now. The chances of me resigning and the next pastor being older than me are slim to none. Yeah. I mean, it's likely going to be a young guy. Yep. And of course, by that time, I might be 60, so he might be 40, but he's going to be younger. Well, that guy's not going to be King James only. Yeah. I mean, 9 times out of 10, and he's certainly not going to be if he's interested in my church. Yeah. Or he's under my training. Yeah. So go ahead and deal with it, man. I mean, let's just deal with it. Okay. So that's the background. Okay. Yeah. And so now I bring this into the certainty that I am going to make this change at my church, and then of course through the podcast, publicly. I mean, it's no surprise, no surprise here that people have taken issue with me on this. Yeah, of course. I mean, I flew into a church back in December. Was going to do a youth winter retreat. Guys arrived me from the airport out to the camp, and former college student, you know him. Yep. And he said, "Man, I'm really sorry, Brother Sam's, but we don't have very many people here." It was like 20. I mean, wow. After Christmas, I flew for 2.5 days to preach to 20 kids, which I love it, no problem. And I was like, oh man, he said, yeah, we've had bigger crowds before. And I was like, and I said, well, it's me, isn't it? And he said, yeah, it's you. And I said, man, I'm sorry, like, you don't need to worry about having me back. Yeah. This is an issue. Like, don't die on this hill, man. Yeah. But I said, why do you think it's such a big deal? He just said, instantly, your podcast. So I put it out there, both publicly, me, and of course then at my church. I made a public transition in both areas. And now, but for, as far as specifically, not everybody's gonna have a podcast voice, but specifically speaking, what steps would I take, or did I take, whenever I actually made the transition at River City? Okay. So I think we should walk through. Yeah, let's get what there. I do 8. I think I wrote down 8.
Yeah, I think you've got 8 of them here.
So let's start. What is number 1?
Yeah. So the first step here, step 1, formulate clear biblical convictions on bibliology.
Yeah. So let's break that whole sentence apart. Yeah. Formulate means you need to learn, study, grow, and create your convictions on the matter. You should be willing and able to write a research paper on it. Yeah. A position paper is what they call them now. You should be able to articulate, formulate, and then the second word, clear. This should be clear with you. If you're not certain, don't do it. Whatsoever is not of faith is sin. If you're not sure about the move, if you're not sure, then don't change, because convictions and clarity must go together. If you're going to lead major change, you better be clear. Biblical, okay. Obviously, formulate your position from the Bible, and then a conviction means I can't change this. Yeah. So I have a conviction about Scripture. I believe that it's inspired, and I believe that preservation predominantly is a reference to original manuscripts. Yeah. And I've heard all the guys rooting into it on Twitter. I ain't seen the manuscripts, and neither have you. Okay. What we mean is that the word preservation in the Bible is not speaking of English translations. It's speaking of the word that God gave, which was not in English. Yeah. I know that is just so novel, but it's really simple. Yeah. Once I believe that it's inspired and the original was preserved, then I make my best position on a language translation based upon formal equivalency and readability. It's just that simple. You got to have a Bible that's true to original languages, and you got to have a Bible that you can read.
Yeah.
Okay, those are convictions. So the King James falls out of line on the second one.
Yeah.
The Message falls out of line on the first one.
Yep.
And we talked about this last night at my house.
Mm-hmm.
Eugene Peterson never intended for it to be a translation.
True translation, yeah.
So if you read it like that, it's a great help.
Yeah.
Just like the amplified version of the Bible. But we wouldn't consider those even Bible. They're paraphrases.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like a commentary.
Yep.
But within the two, then I have to pick something that's reliable and I have to be something that's readable.
Sure.
Those are the issues. Those are the convictions. I believe the Bible's the Word of God. I believe it's preserved in its original manuscripts. And then as far as translation goes, I have to pick something that is reliable and readable.
Yeah.
And that then so because King James is not readable to most people.
Yeah.
And certainly many parts of it, and that's where Mark Ward comes in the conversation.
Yes. Yeah.
Once I sorted through all this theology and then sorted through the book Authorized,
Yeah.
the convictions were there.
Yeah,
I mean, I am literally convicted that I am not going to use the King James Version of the Bible in my church and to my family. So that's it. Now, all of a sudden, something's got to change.
Yeah. Sure.
So go ahead.
Yeah, well, I do have a question. Maybe it's a little bit of a rabbit trail, but for you now that you form these convictions, are there any translations that you would say, you mentioned the Message, but like you said, the Message never intended to be a translation,
Right.
as a paraphrase. I think some people misunderstand that.
Right.
And it would help them if they would realize what that is. I like your analogy with a commentary.
Yeah.
But are there any actual translations? I know we've got like the Ebonics version and emoji version. These
Yeah,
similar,
the
but
magazine type.
are there any translations that you're like, I actually am kind of hesitant on these?
Sure.
Because of their philosophy of translation.
Yeah, for sure. So you find things that are intentionally more dynamic
Yes.
in their equivalence, which means they're trying to really convey the thought.
Yeah, and that'd be like the NIV, NLT.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Then there are those who are trying to really be formal. And so when I made the transition, I told our church that I'm recommending 5 translations to you for your own personal reading for your family. Here's what we're going to do. And I got a whole episode on this.
Yep.
We can maybe reference that in the
let's
notes.
reference that.
But these are modern translations that are formal and equivalent. So New American Standard, New King James Version, English Standard Version, and Christian Standard Bible, and then of course NIV is going to be over here in this. If you have had a spectrum here,
There actually is a really cool graphic out there. If I can
Maybe we can
find
find
it, maybe
that,
I'll
put it
link
in the
to
notes.
it. But it shows you the spectrum from formal all the way over to the paraphrases.
So for me, I wanted to be more safe in the reliability, the formal. So you can go over to NIV or New Living Translation, as you mentioned, or CEB. There's tons of them.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to want to use those predominantly for worship. Again, I'm not against it that people do. I'm just saying for me, I had the conviction that dynamic formal equivalence is a priority.
Yeah.
And I can find readability and formal equivalency together. So that's why ESV was on the table for me. New King James was. And frankly, Christian Standard Bible was. I may have went with that if it wasn't so new at the time. So those are the convictions. That's a great question. So yeah, I actually have convictions. I mean, I have versions that we would not use as the teaching Bible at the church.
Yeah.
And I gave that list I just mentioned to the church and said, these are great options if you're looking for maybe something a little better for readability. My children use the ESV in their devotions, scripture memory, and things of that nature. And again, you can listen to the episode where I talk about why I chose the New King James instead of the ESV. It's kind of pragmatic, and that's all okay. But if you follow translation discussion, you will also know that they're very similar.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in fact, I preached with my New King James in an ESV church, and there's, in the particular text I was preaching from, there was virtually no difference.
Yeah.
And
I'll chime in here too. There's very little difference other than the Old English words between the ESV and the KJV. You just follow along.
Yeah, and so a lot of times if you're listening to a King James preacher and he says this word means this, you're going to have an ESV open and you're going to go that. Bang, right like that. So, and that's one of the just simplest arguments of, well, why not we just, come on, man, let's just update. Like my son, why don't we just say it?
Sure.
And so, but hey, you don't skip this step, Luke. I mean, here's the thing. Don't go ramrodding something in. If you're not articulate and you do not know, and certainly if you're not convicted about it, you don't want to, because you could easily destroy a church over this. And I would say there are some situations, which is my number two. I'll go ahead and introduce it.
Let's go right to it.
Number two is you got to be sensitive to your own unique ministry context. Okay, and here, let me make this kind of sub-statement here. Remember this. The consciences of your people have been mistakenly, yet passionately tethered to this position. Here's the problem. Some people have been forcefully, dynamically told that Psalm 12, 6, and 7 is a promise about the King James Bible. Now, I know it's not. You know it's not. Anybody that's a fairly cognitive reader of the Bible, a student of grammar, a student of context, is going to say that's talking about the people being preserved, not the words. I mean, look, even grammatically. And I've heard people try to twist that one out and explain it away. Let's just be honest here. Psalm 12, 6, 7 has nothing to do with the Bible. Okay. Now, but what do you do with John Smith in your pew, who has been told, and not just told that with passion, it was tethered to the Bible. And he thinks, in his mind, he has a conviction. Okay, so here's something everybody needs to understand about my church. And this is very important because I don't want anybody to go run away from this podcast episode, preaching from a new Bible next Sunday and have a meltdown on their hands, because it could happen. My change had already happened at this church. Our church split in 2019 over bigger issues, over philosophical issues, styles, black ceilings in the auditorium, modern worship, and a myriad of other things. So by the time I changed Bibles, 2021, it was all over. The COVID purge had happened. The church was a whole new church. This is the third church I've pastored. I pastored the original church. I pastored the carnal church, where people started coming out of the woodwork, IFB people. And now I'm pastoring my church. And so I may pastor 5 churches along the way. I don't know, but this has been so what would I say to you? I would say you need to know your own unique ministry context. Here's a question. If you changed the Bible right now in your church, would it destroy your church? If the answer is yes, don't do it. Don't do it. Don't even talk about it. So let me make a couple of statements about how you can begin changing the ministry context. Okay? First of all, you may not be able to. It may mean that if the conviction is real, if number one is true and you know you're never going to change it, you might need to leave. I mean, just face it. Or, go ahead.
So you're saying if you have this conviction as a pastor, but you know that the church is just, like you said, it'll destroy the church. You're saying it might be actually time for you to transition out.
Oh, absolutely. You either need to change ministries or 2, start changing the ministry context. Or 3, live with it. And 3 is not an option for me. Okay. So then real quick, and I know we'll probably run out of time here today, but in what ways can I begin to shift the ministry context? And I got like 2 or 3 of them. And this may take 5 years. It may never happen. But how can it? Well, number one, I'm going to eliminate any kind of King James-only lingo. I'm just going to eliminate it. I'm going to quit saying things like, open your King James Bible, bless God, or how many of y'all glad for the old book? I mean, I'm going to start defanging this and just not talk about it. And number 2, I'm going to test waters by maybe mentioning things like this. If we were translating this word today, we would say this. This word means this. Now, if you're in an ultra radical King James church, you can't even say that. You'll know because you'll have a line a mile long at your office door.
Well, you can't explicitly say that, but I hear I hear pastors do it all the time.
Oh,
They
yeah.
say, what this passage is saying is this, I mean, when we think about, I remember being in your homiletics class, you'd go through the different phases, and one of them was explanation. You
Yep.
start when you're dissecting this part of the passage, you start with explanation, illustration, application. Explanation is the first step regardless. And
Right.
so they're doing it, but they may not be explicitly wording it in the way you're talking
And I
about.
think if you're a little more intentional, and you'll test the waters, you'll start saying things, and it's not like this is a bad. I think it's terrible when somebody says it's a bad translation.
Yeah.
I mean, come on, you're surely not that arrogant.
Yeah.
That's a sophomoric. This is what sophomores in Greek 1 do.
Yeah.
They, King James is a terrible translation. You wouldn't know your elbow from your rear end, man, honestly. Like, what are you talking about? You don't know.
Yeah.
Like, you know more than that committee of translators. No, you don't.
Yeah.
No, you don't.
Yeah. And the arrogance goes both ways.
It goes both ways.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Come on, man. Like, we're not going to do that. But I can say, if this word was being translated in 2023, we would say this.
Yeah.
Or in the original language, this is an present tense, active voice, imperative mood, verb.
Yeah.
And what I'm showing is there's study here. There's stuff going on here. There's more than sometimes meets the eye, and it's my job to teach you the Bible.
Yeah.
So there's that. Then, later on in the process, somebody preached here and used a different translation. Now, I kicked the nest a little bit. That was 2 years before we changed.
And that was a strategic move on your part?
Not necessarily. In fact, it's a funny story there. Let me tell it real quick because this is great.
Yeah.
So I invited H.B. Charles Jr. to preach at our church for the first time when this building that we're sitting in right now had a grand opening in 2018. This is before the church split.
Yeah.
I went out and bought him a beautiful King James Bible. I'm talking like calfskin, leather, had his name put on it, Dr. H.B. Charles. Put it in a box with a letter, like mail, and I sent it to him. And it basically said, "Thank you so much for coming to preach here. I'm so honored that you're coming. I bought this Bible for you, and in my context, it would really help me if you wouldn't mind using this Bible. And I can explain it if you want to. It's a long story. This church has traditionally been King James only, and I just sent it. Never said another word about it.
Yeah.
The night he preached, this is November 5th, 2018.
Yeah.
The service started at 5. He thought it started at 6. He shows up at 4:58. They're playing some music starting.
Yeah.
Crowds. This is the night of our grand opening. We had 400 in church that morning.
Wow.
Huge crowd. I am panicking, thinking I'm going to have to preach. He walks in. He sits down in our conference room, and he's being very casual, very slow. We laugh about it now.
Yeah.
He's putting chapstick on. He's getting his stuff out, and I saw him. He pulled out ESV.
Yeah.
And it just immediately I went, he didn't get it.
Yeah.
The secretary didn't pass it on. It didn't happen. And oh no. I just decided, the best thing for the Spirit is just don't say anything.
Yeah.
This is not gonna be good. Well, he did. And there were a couple people that said something later, but not many. In fact, one of my deacons, I went to him after the service, and I walked up to him. His name was Jeff. I said, "Jeff, I just got to tell you." And I was going to tell him that story. And he stopped me and said, "It's a doubtful thing, preacher. Don't even worry about it."
Wow.
Because I had recently preached on Romans 14, which would be the final step, I would say, would be you need to be teaching your people about latitude. You need to be teaching your people about gray areas.
Yeah.
Romans 14, 1 Corinthians 8 through 10,
Yeah.
and many other places. You need to be teaching them that there are Christians that have varying opinions on different things, and it's okay.
Individual soul liberty.
Individual soul liberty, which we don't believe is independent Baptist.
But it's in the acrostic.
It's in the acrostic.
But we don't
and
really
the acrostic is ordained.
Yeah.
So I would say that you have to be sensitive to that.
Yeah.
And you got those 3 options, and you have to decide what you're going to do with that.
Yeah. Well, there are several more steps here, and we're going to get to those in the next episode.
Hey, see you next week, man. Let's go.
Yeah, thanks for joining us for Church Advance with Bryan Sams, and we'll see you next time. Thanks again for joining us for this episode, and please don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'd also really love it if you take a moment to leave us a 5-star review and then share this podcast with your fellow church leaders or pastor friends. If you'd like to connect with us, send us a question, learn more about Church Advance, head over to bryansams.com. That's bryansams.com. This podcast is hosted by Bryan Sams and produced by myself, Luke Clayton, and my team at mustangcrease.com. Thanks again for joining us. We look forward to having you join us in the next episode as we continue to advance the fellowship, partnership, and gospel hope amongst Bible-believing pastors and churches right here on Church Advance with Bryan Sams.